get things set up. Where's the thing that I need to stop?
Sounds so organized.
Yeah. Well, like I said, uh, I was when I started the stream earlier. I said I was literally flying by the seat of my pants. So we're just gonna keep that trend running.
Nice, nice.
Yeah. So we're back. Um, Juan, I don't know if you were watching the stream, but just
Oh, I
finished.
might want to do that.
Yeah, I just finished Call of Duty World at War.
Is it on Twitch?
Yeah,
Right? Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, but now we're back with my good friend Juan Johnson. If you have watched any of the streams from the Tattooed Historian that we used to do Friday nights, streaming for Don and later Tannenberg, Juan's been on a number of them. And so we've had you always come prepared with interesting stories, sometimes about World War One, sometimes about just
Sometimes
random
just
shit.
random stuff. Yeah.
But today you have some very interesting stuff that you've been working on in your free time on Formula One racing. So that's what you're gonna talk to us about. And you know, when you were telling me about this, I told you to tell me very little. I wanted to be
Yeah.
surprised when you came on to talk about this. So, why don't you, you know, give us a little bit of introduction about what your research has been on.
Yeah, so mainly my paper was on which wasn't for class, by the way, which is kind of ironic because it's the longest paper that I've ever written. But yeah, so my paper, I decided to focus on safety standards and hazards in the 50s and 60s, primarily the 60s, but that era was known as it was known as the golden age of Formula One racing. Um, but it's also known as the killer years by some other people. And one of the reasons why it's known as the golden age is because of the amount of technological advancements that were made during that one decade, going from the 50s into the 60s, and the amount of dangers that came with the drivers during this era was just honestly crazy. And obviously, when you think about racing back then, you would automatically think, it's going to be dangerous. But you never really realize until you start doing the research how dangerous it actually was and how specific the dangers were.
Okay.
And for my paper, I decided to just kind of focus on. I decided to use BBC documentary called Grand Prix: The Killer Years, and there's also a book which is basically like an extended interviews for the documentary, and it's all filled with firsthand accounts by the surviving drivers and also wives and I guess wives, girlfriends, and non-drivers like either track managers or newspaper like journalists, people like that. Which is just a really good documentary, very well made. And the book is given that the book is extended interviews, it adds a layer of context that you wouldn't get
Um,
exactly.
just quick question: is there anywhere folks could access this documentary?
So I had to do a bit of digging to try and find it online.
Okay.
Not exactly sure. 'Cause, BBC documentaries are kind of finicky to
Yeah.
find, especially if they're kind of old.
Hmm.
I mean, without with doing some simple, I guess, digging for free stuff, pretty sure that you could find it.
Yeah.
It's definitely worth the watch.
Okay.
But I started out my paper by, I guess, listing off some of the things that people initially think with Formula One safety standards and hazards in the 50s and 60s. So I guess I'll start that here with you. What what comes to mind? I guess trying to put everything else that I've already told you out of your head. What initially comes to mind when you think about safety hazards or standards?
Well, I mean,
And
generally, I think I don't think anyone would argue that or argue against what I'm about to say. But when you think of Formula One racing, it's generally very, very fast, and there do tend to be a lot of turns, and uh, I would imagine that would cause a bit of a hazard. Hitting those fast turns.
yeah, to say the least.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else that comes to mind?
Um, Nothing that's really coming to mind right now, but I'm sure
Mhm.
you have something
Yeah,
in mind.
yeah. Well, whenever I ask people this, primarily my parents and some friends, and probably maybe you as well. Well, obviously just now, but
Yeah.
um, the initial thoughts were helmet protection not being great. Um, like tires on the cars being a little too small, as you can see in the picture there that
Yeah.
you have. Um, Head trauma knowledge not being very great, and obviously, the simple thing that is crashing.
Yeah.
But I mean, crashing is obviously a hazard in any motorsport ever, and it still
Yeah.
is. But a lot of these problems are um, not what exactly you would think with dangers and safety standards, and not everything is about the cars. There's multiple different things that play a role into the safety hazards
Yeah.
back then. There's the drivers themselves, the tracks individually, or just standard across the board stuff in for the tracks. Even the spectators as well play a role in the safety standards and even the hazards and other things, natural and man made as well. Um, and obviously, modern safety standards aren't nowhere close to what they were in the 50s and 60s. For example, I guess today we have seatbelts in every single car, and
Yeah.
it's like a standard, wear your seatbelt or you get a ticket or something like that. In the 50s and 60s, well, even before that, well, technically Formula One started in the early 50s. I want to say 1950 is when it officially started, but racing and Grand Prix racing and all that started like well into maybe like the 1910s, maybe 1900s. So it's been going on for a really long time. But seatbelts were not mandatory until like the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. They were not mandatory.
Ah.
Fireproof overalls were also not mandatory until that time. In the basically until like the mid 60s, helmets were primarily made of leather, and fire was always a concern. Like 90% of the time, if you crashed into something, that the car was probably going to go up in flames. And a lot of the time, drivers kind of refer to the cars as being pretty much just a bathtub with fuel. So,
Ah.
yeah, that's just a little hint of what the safety standards and risks were, and just looking at that little bit of what it was, it would make you wonder why drivers kept driving if they or kept racing rather if there were these general risks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty much what my paper is trying to tackle. Um, Trying to tackle this question of why they kept racing, even though there were these risks, but also looking at the other risks and a bit of the context leading into the 60s.
Okay.
So in my paper, I decided to just kind of throw you into um, into a race, and also I'll try to explain how Formula One works with a regular race, and other things like that. I guess like a little bit of the terminology and other things like that. So, starting off with the 1961 Italian Grand Prix at Monza, obviously in Italy. I don't exactly know where Monza is. Um, I want to say it's somewhere close to where Ferrari started. I want to say that, but anyway. So, to start off, the 1961 Italian Grand Prix was it was I want to say it was the last race in the 61 season. and the championship was being led by two Ferrari drivers, teammates. One of them was a German named Wolfgang von Trips, and the other was American Phil Hill.
Mm-hmm.
And so Von Trips, he was given two nicknames. One was Count Crash because he was actually from German royalty, but early on in his career, he was known for crashing a whole lot and also surviving. But it wasn't that he was a bad driver. He was a good driver, but he was just a little bit aggressive. But his fellow drivers and the spectators liked him. So they gave him another nickname called Taffy, which is kind of like a, it's kind of like a, it's a nickname that's I think given. It's like bravery, like a sense of Welsh bravery.
Yeah.
I think it was given after a river in Wales, I believe.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, so Phil Hill was an American driver driving for Ferrari, and he was on his way to be the first American to win a Formula One championship. But he was a number of points behind Von Trips. It was, they were racing against each other, and they were teammates.
Yeah.
But that was not the only thing that those two had to worry about. They had to worry about general car malfunctions, which in the 50s and 60s, um, reliability in cars was just not there, just did not exist. So oftentimes a good driver could be taken out of a race because their car, like a piece on their car, broke. And it wasn't necessarily the driver's fault or anything like that. It was just simple, reliability in the 60s. That's just what happened.
Yeah.
And depending on your car manufacturer, determine how well you could rely on it and how much you could push that car to its limit. So aside from that, obviously they had to worry about crashing and simple things like that. But also, I think the biggest worry for them, well, aside from crashing, of course, was other drivers. Um, Jim Clark was an up and coming British driver. Um, he was driving a Lotus Climax, which the Lotus was already kind of known for being light and quick, but it would later become one of the best known cars of that decade. And another driver, Jack Brabham, was an Australian driver. He was already a winner of the 1959 and the 1960 championships. So obviously, this man's doing it all, um, and back to back as well. So they have to worry about multiple different things. And so, um, qualifying, you have to qualify for each race, and it's kind of, I guess, like any sort of thing. So qualifying, the way qualifying works is it's a mixture of practice and qualifying, if that makes sense. Well, I'll
Yeah.
hope it makes sense. So back in the 60s, or well, nowadays, there are separate days for practice, and then there's separate periods for qualifying. Now you practice, obviously, you just go around the track until you get the hang of it and get into a good flow. And qualifying is a timed lap. So during qualifying, you start and you go as fast as you can to get the best possible qualifying position. And once you qualify for a certain position, that's the position that you start during the race. It doesn't matter where you are in the championship points or anything like that. Just that's where you start in that specific race.
Mm-hmm.
So Von Trips qualified for P1, which is first position. Phil Hill qualified for P4. Jim Clark qualified for P7. And I'm pretty sure Jack Brabham was further down the line in the grid. Which, by the way, the grid was made up of 32 different cars.
Okay.
So, um, with Phil Hill's points at that time, he needed to finish the race in P3, I believe, to actually no, I'm sorry. Wolfgang von Trips needed to finish the race in P3 to win. Um, so that's where he was in the points. He didn't even have to finish in first to win. So that's how points are. It's a little confusing at first, given that people always think you have to win first place to win and things like that. But that's not how it works in Formula One. So the race starts, and it's just a little bit of a heads up. The Monza, which they still race at today, was known and is still known as the Cathedral of Speed, and it also had a oval and very fast corners. And the oval, which is no longer used today, the oval was put in place so that Ferrari could win a Grand Prix at their home Grand Prix, basically.
Okay.
And the thing that the Ferraris were very good at was straight line speed. So that's what the oval was there for, and they could do well in the other fast turns and corners and bankings at Monza. So to start out, Monza didn't start very well. At the end of the opening lap, there was a crash. Jerry Ashmore was driving for Lotus, and he crashed at a turn called Parabolica. Um, he took too much speed into the corner and clipped the grass. And once you clip anything that's not pavement in these old cars, you don't know where you're going.
Hmm.
Because the tires they had like close to zero grip, and drivers had to drive with that in mind. They basically had kind of created tandem drifting in Formula One in the 50s and even way before that because of the power of the cars and also the lack of grip in the tires. So he survived that crash, but he was pretty badly injured. And then halfway through the second lap was when the worst the worst accident in Formula One history occurred. So Von Trips had just passed Jim Clark, and Clark immediately moved to repass Von Trips. And at some point, Von Trips shifted towards his right, and his right rear wheel and Clark's left front interlocked.
Hmm.
And this pushed both cars up an embankment and towards the crowd, and the crowd was behind a simple chain link fence. So Von Tripp's Ferrari plowed right into the crowd. Von Trips was ejected. He hit the trees on the other side of the crowd, was killed, and his car spun and ended up back on the track. And Jim Clark was unharmed. His car was out of commission, but he was resting at the bottom of a ditch. And 15 spectators, including Von Trips, were well, not including 15 spectators plus Von Trips were killed. And this is only the second lap in this 100 lap race. And as per the rules of Formula One back then, the race had to continue no matter if there was a crash or if they were dead there. So during the rest of this 100 lap race, the bodies were being tied away, and and eventually Phil Hill did end up winning the race and became the first American to win a Formula One championship. But obviously, with Von Trips dead, kind of because of it,
Yeah.
it was a sad victory for Ferrari as well as Grand Prix in general.
Yeah. So you sent me a couple photographs
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
prior to this, and I know one of them, at least one of them, is a crash.
yeah. That's later on.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was the 1961 Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Did you have any initial thoughts or questions? Because that's just one race.
Well, it's starting to sound like this Formula One stuff is a bit. We don't really care if people die. We just want the race to happen. um,
Yeah, that was pretty much the mentality, especially from the spectators.
yeah, and also a quick note: I looked up where Monza is. It's right outside of Milan in northern
Oh,
Italy.
all right. Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, it seems like there's a bit of a devil may care attitude, not just on the part of the drivers, but on the part of like everyone involved in Formula One
Yeah.
racing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they in especially when it gets to like the late '60s and early '70s, it just starts to become more blatant, and they don't really care. They're showing that they didn't really care about safety and other things like that when those questions finally came up.
Yeah.
But yeah, a bit of the context going into the '60s. This is more of like a technological bit of context. So going into the 60s, or well, the 50s rather. Um, Cars were. I guess there's one picture. I think it's the first one that I sent you.
Is it the one that's currently showing?
No, it's not that one. It's the one before that.
No, wrong one. Just tell me when to stop.
All right. Yeah, keep going.
This one?
Nope, keep going.
You sure? Because that's the last actual photograph.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that one.
This
Yeah,
one? All right.
yeah, that one. All right. Yeah, it's a bit of a delay for me on Twitch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this car, it's basically a typical 1950s car. So it's a front engine car, which meant that front engine cars they were the generic cars until 1959. Well, until the 60s, I should say. So front engine cars they had to be driven a different way compared to 60s cars. Since they were front engine, they were heavier. The rear was heavier, which meant that the cars were more likely to swing around, and that's kind of how drivers had to drive their cars around these corners. And this specific car is being driven. Well, it's a 1959 Ferrari 256 F1, being driven by an American Dan Gurney.
Okay.
During the 1959 German Grand Prix. And the 1959 German Grand Prix ended in a historic Ferrari 1-2-3, which meant that the first, second, and third positions were occupied by Ferraris when they crossed the line. And because of this, and in the 50s, Ferrari was a big name manufacturer, and Ferrari was known for being victorious. One manufacturer that was not known for being victorious or successful was Cooper, and I want to say Cooper ended up becoming, I guess, the cars that we see today, like the Mini Coopers,
Yeah.
things like that. A British company. So people seeing Ferrari win 1-2-3 at the 1959 German Grand Prix did not prepare them to see Cooper, a company that was not known for victory at all, win the 1959 championship overall, as well as the 1960 championship. And you could go back to the first picture
All right.
that you had on there.
This one?
Just waiting for it to. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
So this car, this is a 1960 Cooper Climax T53 being driven by the Australian Jack Brabham during the 1960 Belgian Grand Prix. So you can clearly see a difference between the 1959 Ferrari and the Cooper. So one of the big differences, obviously, is the shapes. Well, this car is a rear engine car. The engine has been moved from the front to the back, which makes it lighter, but it also makes it more agile and quicker than any of the cars that had been the generic for the 50s. And rear engine cars are still used today in Formula One as well as regular civilian cars. So once the brothers Charles and John Cooper, once they figured this out, they essentially rewrote the Grand Prix rule book overnight. And once Jack Brabham won the 1960 championship, everybody realized that they had to go rear engine. Like there's no other way around it. Enzo Ferrari was a little stubborn though, because he believed that industrial might and not and not technological thinking or ingenuity would win the day. So he was stubborn, and he was being proven wrong by these quote unquote maverick British designers working out of sheds, basically. um, he started referring to them as garagistas, which is an Italian term for wine vendors, is what I could find. Which is a little interesting. I don't know why you would insult somebody by calling them a wine vendor, but hey, it's the Italians, I guess. So Enzo Ferrari eventually realized that he had to create rear-engine cars, cars, and that's what you saw in 1960, the 1960 Grand Prix season. Well, one British manufacturer, Colin Chapman, he saw Cooper's technological feats, and he decided to take them and try to make his own team. And this was Team Lotus. And I believe the first Lotuses to be seen might have been in 1960, possibly. I could be wrong on that. So actually, believe it was 1960. Um, might have been 1959, but I believe 1960 might have been the first Grand Prix where Lotuses were seen and used. But don't quote me on that. So Colin Chapman, he took what Cooper did, and he wanted to take it a step further. And by a step further, I mean what he wanted to do was he wanted to create racing machines that were going to obviously beat the opposition, but there would be nothing like them. And in the book that I used, there is a mechanic. I believe he was a mechanic. Let me find it here. Find his quote. So Len Terry, he was actually he was actually Lotus's chief designer from 1963 to 1965, and he actually helps to um, describe the technical dilemma that plagued British teams early on in the 60s. But he also goes on to talk about the solution that pushed Lotus ahead of the game, and that also changed Grand Prix forever. And it also gives um, a bit of insight into how Formula One cars and designing the cars goes into. So he says, "quote Speaking technically, to get good acceleration, you need the best power to weight ratio. And right now, meaning in the early 60s in Britain, everyone in the country was using the same engine. So everybody basically had the same power. So the only way to beat the opposition was to add lightness, and that's what we tried to do. Colin, most of the time, carried it to extremes, and consequently, his cars, although they were quick, were also very fragile and tended to break. And so, in the 1960 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps, they everybody realized how dangerous Colin Chapman's thinking really was. So, during the 1960 Belgian Grand Prix, there were a total of four accidents, and three of them were in Lotuses. And two drivers were killed, and two could have been killed. So the first one, Sterling Moss, he crashed during practice and he survived. Sterling Moss actually died last year.
Oh,
He was a British. Yeah, he died April 12th, 2020. Now, one of the crashes, there's a picture of. It's the guy with his face in the corner.
okay, yeah, I have that up.
All right. Yeah. So, Alan Stacy, he was driving down the Mossa Strait at Spa, and he was hit. He was going about 140, maybe 150 plus miles per hour, and he was hit in the face by a bird, which probably broke his neck going that fast. Obviously lost control, and he crashed into a ditch, and the car burst into flames, and Stacy as well as the car were burnt up, and that's all that was left after they got Stacy out of it.
Jesus.
Chris Bristow was driving a Cooper. He lost control at a turn called Malmedy, and he crashed into an embankment. Was ejected from the car because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and he was decapitated when he landed on a barbed wire fence. And then the last crash was Mike Taylor. He crashed during practice when his steering column sheared, and he sued Chapman because Taylor had actually bought the car privately, so he was kind of entitled to say, you sold me something that was defective. I want my money back. Not to mention Taylor was also severely injured because of it.
Yeah.
So the suit was settled in court in Taylor's favor, and Lotus had a black mark on its reputation, which took a long time to erase. So that was the 1960 Belgian Grand Prix, and again, this is also part of the accepted face of what Formula One was um, in the 50s and 60s.
I'm a little curious. Um, was this also like the accepted, standard amongst the audience? Like, did the
Yeah,
audience just was
yeah.
like, oh, that dude just lost his head, literally. Cool. Anyway, back to the race.
I mean, pretty much. This is just in general what was accepted about Formula One. Everybody knew it was dangerous, but if it was just something you did, and there was nothing you could do about it except not do it.
Oh, all
Like
right.
that was pretty much it. I mean, obviously the spectators, they don't want to see people die, but one of the people in the documentary said it kind of perfectly. You kind of just have to have a separate appreciation that um, people in the 50s and 60s just had a different, I guess, exception slash appreciation of life and death than we do today. And so, I guess going on about death, essentially every track in the 50s and 60s was a death trap of sorts. And just to give a couple of examples, the Nurburgring in Germany, which I'm not sure if you've heard of, you've probably heard of Nurburg.
Yeah.
Yeah, because of World War II. So yeah, the Nurburgring in Germany, which is one of Germany's oldest tracks, is still used today. It's more used today for 24-hour endurance races. Um, there's Silverstone, which was an old RAF base from World War II in the UK. Monza, of course, in Italy. There's Monaco and Monte Carlo, which I think back then it might have been part of France, but now it's just its own country.
Yeah.
And then Spa Francorchamps in Belgium. And so some general track safety standards that you could find across the board. I mean, obviously every track is different, but some safety standards across the board. One, well, when you think of modern races, with especially with NASCAR, using NASCAR as an example, the pit lane is kind of always what people look forward to seeing. The quick little, like, you stop and get fuel and change the tires and keep going.
Yeah.
Um, the pit lanes are always, they're separated by a wall. There are specific lines for each team, each car, and all that. There's perfect safety standards for everything. Back in the 50s and 60s, there were open pit lanes, and often what you would find for a pit lane that told you, this was the pit lane and this is where you raced, was just a simple line drawn. That was pretty much the most you could find. Um, Depending on the track, like for example, um, Silverstone had an actual wall that divided the pit lane, but generally it was literally just a line drawn and then line boxes that were drawn. That was it.
So,
Um,
so theoretically, someone could lose control driving near the pit
yeah,
lane and just crash into the pit lane.
yeah, pretty
Oh, that
much.
that's great.
Yeah, tires and fuel drums were just kind of strewn about and just open. And one thing that was definitely a characteristic of the 50s and 60s was drivers would often light up a cigarette while waiting for the car to be fueled, or waiting for the tires to be changed. So this entire system was just waiting for something bad to happen.
Yeah.
Um, as far as barriers to protect the cars going into walls and things like that, the general safety standard was a hay bale barrier, which, when you think about it, it's not going to stop a car going 100 plus miles per hour.
Yeah.
But they didn't realize that back then. But I mean, this is more like hindsight. You could always say something like, they didn't realize this back then. They didn't think about it back then. But it's like they kind of didn't care. Spectators were allowed to stand wherever they wanted. Um, Drivers often wore cotton shirts, um, leather helmets. This was characteristic of the 50s and the early 60s.
Yeah.
Like I said earlier, seatbelts were not mandatory, but this was because They actually had some sort of method, or they had some method to their insanity, basically. The reason why drivers chose not to wear seatbelts was because they thought it would be better for them to walk away, basically get ejected from the car, maybe get a broken bone or something, and they thought it was better to walk away with broken bones than it was to be trapped in the car and basically cremated
Mm.
once the car burst into flames. Um, and again, fireproof overalls were not mandatory until the like mid to late '60s, and definitely by the early '70s, they were definitely mandatory.
Now you say they're not mandatory, but were there did some drivers just decide, hey, there's a pretty good chance that this thing's gonna burst into flames if I crash. I should probably wear some fireproof overalls.
Yeah, some drivers, I think by the mid '60s, it was common to see drivers wearing their fireproof overalls. But again, it was not mandatory in the rules. They did
Yeah.
not have to wear them for their own safety and others, I guess.
Okay.
Now, and I guess that's the same for seatbelts as well. Some cars, I guess, just didn't worry about putting seatbelts in. Um, some drivers, I guess, wanted seatbelts. It just depended, but again, it wasn't mandatory in the official rules.
Okay.
But two of the most infamous tracks in Formula One alone are Monaco and Spa-Francorchamps.
Okay.
So starting off with Monaco, Monaco is a street circuit through the streets of Monte Carlo. Um, again, not a regular racetrack circuit. It was a normal business street for people to just go about their business, walk around, drive home, drive from home, whatever. So that meant narrow streets. There was little room for error. Um, the pit lane was open and there was just a line drawn, but the streets of Monaco were small, and with that extra line drawn just for the pit lane, made it even smaller. Um, there was also a chicane in it, so there's a couple of pictures that I have for that.
Okay. Me.
It should be cars driving around a corner.
Is it this one?
Let's see, yeah, that's one of them.
Okay.
And the other pictures from the other, I guess the car coming towards the cameraman. But
Me.
yeah. So that wall there that's aligned.
Yeah.
So a chicane in racing is basically kind of like a kink in the road
Mm.
to help cars slow down. And yeah, there's a good. That's the other one.
Yeah.
Um, so it's basically a kink in the road to help cars slow down when they're going on a straight. But the thing with Monaco is that this chicane, which is also the famous Monaco chicane, wasn't a real chicane. Basically, it was two roads that came out of one, and they just blocked off the one road, so the drivers had to turn into the other one.
Hmm.
Now, it doesn't look that bad in the pictures, but imagine driving maybe like 120 miles an hour, and then you all of a sudden you have to slow down going downhill in a car that's basically a bathtub filled with fuel, and the tires don't have much grip already, and then you have to swerve in to avoid this wall.
That doesn't sound like a fun time.
No, it wasn't. And on the other side is literally the harbor. It's literally it's the Mediterranean right there on the other side of that wall.
Oh.
So yeah, and the thing that's protecting one of the barriers that's on the other side in front of that wall is hay bale. It's a hay bale barrier on the other side, and it was realized in 1967 during the 1967 Monaco Grand Prix that hay bale barriers were not great. So, Ferrari driver, have you seen Ford v Ferrari?
I have not.
It's a great movie. It's not about Formula One, though. It's about endurance racing, specifically the 24 Hours of Le Mans, which is still a thing today. Um, but yeah, it's definitely a great movie, but it does have a bit of insight into what racing was like in the 60s. And one other thing was that drivers often did both Formula One endurance racing and some other racing during that era. It was common to see drivers do multiple different leagues of racing, and I guess I'll get into that a little later. But one of the drivers in the Ferrari driver, the number one Ferrari driver in Ford v Ferrari, was Lorenzo Bandini, and I think that Ford v Ferrari is based on the 1966 Le Mans. So a year later, during Monaco, Lorenzo Bandini was driving, and it was the 82nd lap, again out of 100 laps. And Bandini he clipped the end of the chicane there, where you could see the Honda driving around. He clipped the end of the chicane, spun across the track, and crashed into the hay bales, and burst into flames. And obviously, the hay acted as an accelerant. And that's the picture with the fire there.
This one?
Let's see. Yeah, that one. So Bandini spun across the track, hit the hay bale, which behind the hay bale was a solid, I think, concrete wall. So the car just burst into flames once he made contact. And as per the rules, again, the race had to continue. So Bandini's car is just there in the middle of this small track, on fire, and the drivers had to go around him
Jeez.
and keep racing for the rest of the 100 lap race. And since Monaco was a small track, and given the position of Bandini's car, firefighters couldn't put it out because again the track was small. Cars kept coming between Bandini and the firefighters, so they had to let him burn to death. So he's in the car, he's burning to death, and his wife was also at the race and saw her husband burn to death in his car and not receive any help because they just couldn't get to him.
Damn.
And at every pass, the drivers reported that they could smell Bandini burning in his car. And one of the drivers during that race was Jean-Pierre Beltoise, and he said, "quote He burnt in the car, and for the whole race we could smell burning flesh each time we arrived at the bends. It was horrible." End quote.
Wow.
And there's footage of Bandini's crash as well. And in the documentary, they show Bandini's basically, burnt corpse being pulled out of the car. And it, this just even smelling somebody else burning to death in their own car as you pass by, like that would be enough for me to want to quit the whole thing. But drivers kept doing it.
Yeah, this is. I think we're getting to like the big thing that you were constantly telling me about this when you were doing the early research. Is like, that's what you want to find out. Why did these drivers keep doing this, even though they knew the danger and all that?
Yeah. So that's Monaco.
Yeah.
Now Spa-Francorchamps in Belgium, which is one of the most interesting tracks for me personally to look into, and it's also, I don't necessarily want to say it's my most favorite track, but driving in like the different racing sims like Grand Prix Legends and also Assetto Corsa, it's the track it's my go-to track because I kind of know it. Like I know the corners and things like that. But at the same time, I hate Monaco. Not Monaco. I mean, I hate Monaco, but I hate Spa so much.
If there are any folks from Monaco watching, I do apologize.
Spa and Monaco are just god awful tracks. Well, mainly I'm talking about the '60s layout.
Yeah.
The '60s layout, they're literal death traps, and it's awful. So Spa is a 14-kilometer loop that connects multiple Belgian towns. You might recognize a couple of the names of the towns, but one lap around Spa, going about an average of 120 miles per hour or 120 plus, took about 4 minutes. And there's 100 laps of that. And so some of the towns that are connected were Bernonville, Malmedy, and Stavelo. I'm not sure if Blanchemont is one of the towns, but it's one of the corners. Um, but yeah, that 14-kilometer loop connects all of those towns, and Spa is special. It's different from Monaco. So Monaco was a street circuit. Spa was also it. I think it's more qualified as a road circuit rather than a street circuit. So um, Spa, when Grand Prix wasn't there, it was used by normal townspeople just going from place to place, whatever. But it's wider. It's much wider than Monaco, given that it's more open. Um, but it brought on different safety hazards. So again, hay bale barriers were there for the cars, but Spa was Belgian farmland, which meant that there was barbed wire fencing to keep the cattle in, which is what happened to. Let me see who that was that got their head cut off. Chris Bristow. That's what happened to him.
Hmm.
Um, Telephone poles were all over the place, lining the road, connecting the different towns together like they're supposed to.
Yeah.
Houses were there, trees were all over the place, and given the geographical position of the Spa-Francorchamps track, weather was a big deal. It rained a whole lot. Um, it rained a whole lot, and it usually poured when it did rain. And that's what happened during the 1966 Belgian Grand Prix, which is, I think, if not the worst, then one of the worst Belgian Grand Prix in Formula One history. So the race, it started in dry weather, and then one of the drivers that had a horrible experience at this specific Grand Prix. He's in the documentary as well as the book. Sir Jackie Stewart. He was Scottish. He's still alive actually,
Oh.
but he suffered from severe dyslexia. Well, still does. But ironically enough, the dyslexia is what made him so great at driving because it gave him the ability to have a great amount of attention to detail.
Ah.
So his life alone is just kind of inspiring because he had a terrible school experience because of the dyslexia, and there was a huge worry, because of the dyslexia, what would he do for a living? And then, because of that great ability for attention to detail, he was able to do so many other great things, and now he's world famous, and he's also been knighted, so good for him.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he said that so the race started in dry weather, and then quote, by the time we got to about the fourth corner, it was thunder rain, end quote. And this was in the first lap. So some of the best drivers in the world up to that point in 1966 hydroplaned off the track in the first lap, and these like monsoon-like conditions would obviously automatically cancel a race today. And I think people knew that it was going to rain, but they didn't know that it was going to be as bad as it really was. So Jackie Stewart, he crashed. Again, this is in the first lap. He crashed into a woodcutter's hut, knocked down a telegraph pole, and was put unconscious. And he ended up waking up a little bit later, and two drivers, Bob Bondurant and Graham Hill, stopped to help him. And obviously, given the rules, they could have continued, but they stopped to help.
Yeah.
So they had to ask the spectators for wrenches out of their cars to get Jackie out of his car. And meanwhile, the car's cockpit was filling up with fuel, and it could have gone up at any time. And the only person there with first aid experience was a nun. And once Jackie got out of the car, he was brought to the aid station at the beginning of the track, and he's covered in fuel, and there are cigarette butts all around him, around the field aid station. So the ambulance finally came and was escorted by a motorcycle policeman, and eventually the motorcycle policeman lost the ambulance, and the ambulance driver didn't know how to get to the hospital in Liège. So it's just a series of errors
Yeah.
that that made Jackie realize that there was something really wrong with this system. And so he eventually organized his own medical cover, and he taped a wrench to his steering wheel for each race, and he eventually got the drivers to pay for a mobile hospital to go around to the different races. And despite these little safety considerations that were put in place, drivers were still dying, and more drivers were going to be dying in the following years. And everybody remained in the mentality that it would just happen to somebody else until there was a wake up call that came in 1968 at the Hockenheim Ring in Germany. But after Spa in 1966, Jackie Stewart went on a safety crusade that is also responsible for the amount of safety standards that we have today.
So it sounds like, a lot of these pushes for safety were coming from the drivers, uh, who had to deal with all the inadequate safety standards.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the drivers were also their own problems because some drivers didn't want things to change, while others, realized that things were too dangerous and things needed to change. It was the track owners and people like that who did not want to change because it was going to have to come out of their pocket
Yeah.
to pay for all these different safety standards and regulations to be made. Um, and um, that's going to come up a whole lot later, in, I believe, 1968 and 1969, when Jackie Stewart actually tries to implement some of these different changes and standards. And again, he's responsible for the safety standards that we have today. The reason why drivers can crash into a wall, and at going like 150 miles an hour, and just get out and walk off.
Mm.
Um, and um, as for the mentality that the drivers had, that it was just going to be somebody else, um, this was also due in part to some of the great drivers that were there. And this goes back to the driver at the beginning, not Von Trips, but Jim Clark. So Jim Clark, he was also Scottish. I think he was his family owned sheep in Scotland, and he grew up just kind of like a farmer's boy, going to school normally, things like that. And in I believe in school uh, he read about Grand Prix racing and things like that, and being a teenager, he got excited about it and wanted to learn more. But there was a family death. I believe his uncle died, and so he had to leave school to help out with the family farm and the business and all that. And so after being so excited about doing being a racing driver and things like that, he got his license. I think he was 17, and got a car. He drove down to this little. It was kind of like a boys and girls club thing put together for everybody, for all the kids and teenagers in that area. Um, so I believe the organization was called Young Farmers or something like that. So he drove down there, and he was driving like a maniac, pretending that he was a race car driver, and he passed somebody on the road who actually was a race car driver, like a small and like local driver, and he passed him, and this guy was just furious, and he was going to the same place as Jim Clark was, and I'm trying to find the name of this man. Um, well, his last couple of names. Okay, so his name was Ian Scott Watson. So Scott Watson, he was furious, like I said, and once he got to wherever Jim was going, which both of them were going to the same place again, he was going to let Jim have it. So about his reckless driving on a regular road. So they met and basically became best friends at some point. And so Scott Watson, he did local races, and he brought Jim along to some of his races. And there was one race that Jim came to, and Scott Watson looked at him and said, "Hey, why don't you try going around, see what it's like? I know I know you wanted to see what racing was like, so take it around the track for a bit because it was a practice session." So after 5 laps, Jim came around, and after 5 laps of driving for the first time in a racing car on a racing track, he came in 3 seconds faster than his friend Scott Watson, and so he pitted. And Clark looked up at him and said, "Why is everybody driving so slow?" And Scott Watson looked back at him and said, "Why? Everybody's not driving slow. Why are you going so fast?" So then he got the idea and realized that Jim Clark had a natural talent for racing. So the next day he let him compete, and I don't want to I don't think he won. I would love to see if he won, but I don't think there's a way to find that out. But he competed in his first ever race, but his transition into the world of motorsport wasn't smooth because Jim didn't realize his own natural talent, and he felt ashamed to be competing against his family's wishes because his father didn't believe that racing was a legitimate way to earn income. But there was a moment where his father told him that if he was going to be a race car driver, he better make it work financially, and eventually that's what Jim Clark did. So, 1958, he raced a Lotus Elite that was given to him um, by the winner of the race because he was so impressed by Jim Clark's ability to drive. And that person that gave him that car was the person who made it, Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus and the manufacturer of the cars. So
Mm-hmm.
the two ended up becoming friends, very close friends. And Jim was offered a spot on Chapman's Formula Junior team, and eventually Clark showed his ability and worked his way up into Formula One. And his first experience in Formula One Grand Prix was also the worst race weekend of the 1960 Formula One season.
Mm.
His second Grand Prix race ever was the 1960 Belgian Grand Prix, where those 4 accidents occurred and those 2 drivers were killed. And one of his friends um, was Chris Bristow, and he witnessed Chris Bristow getting his head cut off at Malmedy, and Clark's Lotus was spattered with the blood of his friend, and he kept racing. But he was also obviously shocked to hear of the death of his teammate and another friend, Alan Stacy.
Mm.
And after the 1960 Belgian Grand Prix, Jim was seriously considering leaving racing, but he stayed with Lotus. And forever since that specific Grand Prix, he hated Spa with a passion, despite the fact that he won at that same track 4 times in succession. So then a year later, the 1961 Italian Grand Prix at Monza happened, and um, we know what happened there. Von Trips and the spectators were killed,
Yeah.
and Clark was obviously involved in that accident, and he felt terrible afterwards. He talked to Chapman about retiring from racing altogether, but Chapman talked him out of that, and made Clark realize that Chapman's engineering slash manufacturing genius, coupled with Clark's talent, natural talent as a driver, would help Lotus excel in Formula One, which it eventually did. And the two were very close, like close as brothers, pretty much. And other drivers were kind of intoxicated with Clark's gentle mannered self and his genuine regard for others. John Surtees, which is he was one of the drivers in the documentary and also in the book, had Jim Clark at his wedding as the best man in 1962, and Jackie Stewart said he was honored to have ever been on the podium with Jim Clark, who was a fellow Scot. And so Clark ended up winning the 1962 and 1965 Formula One championships. But the crazy thing about 1965, earlier I mentioned that it was very common for drivers to do Formula One and also other leagues of racing, like endurance racing and other things like that. Um, Jim Clark took a bit of a hiatus in the beginning of 1965. He missed the Monaco Grand Prix because he was in America competing in the Indy 500. And he won the 1965 Indy 500, and it was his first time in Indy. And then he came back and won the Formula One championship. So I love Jim Clark. He's one of the he's honestly one of the goats of Formula One racing. One of the other goats is Juan Manuel Fangio, who was an Argentinian driver in the 50s. And I think him and Jim Clark are definitely top five, possibly. But this is only going on like racing talent, I suppose. Because if you go by like numerical victories and other things like that, Jim Clark's not that very high on the list, unfortunately. Mainly because Lotus was so unreliable as a manufacturing um, team. The cars often tended to break, and Jim Clark, being the great driver that was kind of he was kind of cheated because of that. But Fangio was quoted to say that Jim Clark was the greatest driver ever, and if Fangio says that, then you know it's true. And both Clark and Fangio rarely crashed, and whenever they were put out of commission, it was due to a vehicle malfunction. And so, uh, although the amount of death, the scary amount of death that surrounded Formula One in the quote unquote golden age of racing, um, the drivers again they stayed in denial about the possibility of it catching up to any of them until 1968 at Hockenheim, during a Formula Two race, um, which I think was it was it was one of the races that one of the people in the documentary described as the kind that you want to just get over and go home. So Hockenheim Ring in Germany um, was it wasn't like Spa. I mean, it was surrounded by trees and other things like that, and other natural hazards. But unlike Spa, it tended to not really rain a whole lot at Hockenheim. But in 1968, during this F2 race, um, it happened to rain. So during this entire weekend, this is April 7th, 1968, when the race was hosted at Hockenheim. It was a Formula Two race, so it was one. It was think of it like this. So Formula One is Major League Baseball. Formula Two is probably Double A.
Okay.
And then Formula Three is Triple A, and then it keeps going down with Formula Junior and other things like that.
Yeah.
So during this Formula Two race, which the only reason why Jim Clark was there was because Lotus had a special what's the word? Lotus had a special uh, advertisement connection that wanted them to race at this Formula Two race. So that's why Jim Clark was there. So the entire weekend was just miserable. It was damp conditions the entire time. Apparently, Jim Clark's Lotus had race damage from the previous weekend that needed to be fixed. But also the other worries for Jim Clark was the rain, obviously, hoping that it was going to be a dry weather race. At least for the race, it was damp the entire weekend. Um, but he also had a young mechanic working on his car named David Sims. His nickname was Beaky Sims. So Beaky was he was the only mechanic on Jim Clark's car that weekend. And so him and Jim communicated personally about how to fix up the car. And in the book, he said, quote, I don't think the weather helped. He wasn't very happy all weekend, although he was still his gentleman self, and Graham Hill wasn't all that happy either. So the one thing that Jim Clark kept going on about was the tires. He kept saying he was worried about the tires. He didn't trust them. He couldn't get any heat into them. Couldn't get any grip out of them. They stayed wet. That was his main worry. And one thing about Jim Clark was that he was terrified of racing in forests. And once the cars left the main grid, they disappeared into a forest. That was Hockenheim. I believe there were 2 or 3 sections in Hockenheim that was just forest with no fencing, no catch fencing, no barriers, nothing.
Hmm.
So Beaky Sims said, Jimmy's last words were, "Don't expect me to be up there in my usual position. I don't trust the tires. I can't get no gripping. Can't get no grip with them. Can't get no heat in them." He didn't like the tires all weekend, hoping there was going to be a drive race, but it wasn't. But he wasn't happy with it at all. I said good luck and see you later, as simple as that. So the race started, and everybody was averaging upwards of 130 miles per hour. Clark was running fifth behind Jean-Pierre Beltoise, and at the start of the 7th lap, Clark didn't come around. So Beaky said he started off and didn't come around. Then a Porsche driver came up and said, "Can you come with me?" While the race was on, I saw the ambulance and thought, "Oh dear."
Hmm.
And then I thought, "Where's the car? Where's Jimmy?" This man said, "Come with me," and I saw what was left of the car. Where's the engine? Where's the gearbox? Someone has taken it. I mean, what's going on? I started to get a little bit scared, and we found the engine and gearbox about 50 yards in the trees. No seat belts, and Jimmy had been flung out of the car and hit his head on the tree. He was about 11 or 12 feet high and in the tree where he got hit, and they wouldn't let me see for obvious reasons. So there's a couple of pictures of I guess pieces of Jim Clark's car that you have.
All right, let me. Is this one of them?
I'm still waiting for the delay
Yeah, there's
on
been.
Twitch. Yeah, that's one of them.
Yeah.
So that's the front. That's the cockpit
Hmm.
of what was left of Jim Clark's Lotus. And the other one, there should be 2 tires and looks like an engine
Yeah.
in between. Yeah, that's the other one. So that was about 50 yards from the tree where Jim crashed into, and that was all that was left.
Hmm.
So yeah, Jim Clark was killed, and ambulance took his body away while the race was still going on, and eventually the race was won by Jean-Pierre Beltoise, and then Jean-Pierre's wife, Jacqueline Beltoise, um, said that even though Jean-Pierre was holding hit the first place trophy on the podium, he was crying while he was holding it because everybody loved Jim Clark, and everybody knew that once he died, it could happen to anybody.
Hmm.
And even to this day, Jackie Stewart is adamant that Jim Clark was not at fault for crashing because Jim Clark does not crash. People were confident that it was most likely a vehicle malfunction that killed Jim Clark, the greatest driver in the world at that point, which is what everybody thought. Everybody believed that. So Graham Hill, Jim Clark's teammate, he was left to deal with the wreckage because Colin Chapman was just in distraught about it. Because imagine it this way: you build a car, your best friend drives it, and then that car that you built for your best friend is what kills him.
Hmm.
So he just couldn't handle it. And there's another picture of 2 drivers together.
Yeah, there we go.
Come on, right there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, on the left is Jim Clark, and on the right is Graham Hill. And one of the things that the drivers loved about Jim Clark was um, was his smile and just his characteristics as his personality, just being a great person in general, both on the track and off the track. And they always trusted in his driving ability because they believed that Jim Clark was one of the drivers that you could race against and not worry about him making a mistake and taking both of you out of the race.
Hmm.
And one of the journalists, David Tremaine, said Jimmy was not the kind of guy you'd ever expect to die in a race car. He was too good for that. And the fact that he did get killed shows again just how dangerous that era was. If Jimmy Clark could get killed, it could happen to anybody. So that was the mentality after 1968. And Jim Clark's funeral was attended by over 50,000 people in his hometown. And after Hockenheim, everybody realized that there needed to be changes. But um, uh, in the 3 months that followed Hockenheim, um, there were these feelings of anger that intensified amongst the drivers as three other Formula One drivers were killed: Mike Spence, Ludovico Scarfiotti, and Joe Schlesser. Now, Schlesser, his death was caught on camera during, I guess, the broadcast of race. I forget which race it was, but Schlesser was driving for Honda, and one of the other surviving drivers, John Surtees, OBE, he used to drive for Honda. He also used to drive for Ferrari, but Honda approached him about this car, which was kind of like it was an experimental car. They approached him about it to drive it, and he admitted that it had some interesting features and that it was good for a test car, a concept car to improve different ideas. But he didn't believe that it was suitable for racing. But Joe Schlesser was brought in by Honda to drive this experimental car that John Surtees believed was not suitable for racing. And so Joe Schlesser crashed during the 1968 French Grand Prix, and the car turned over upside down and burst into flames. But the thing with this concept car was that it wasn't like any other car. It was made of magnesium. So the reason why cars were made of magnesium back then was because it magnesium parts were
Yeah.
much lighter than anything else. So obviously it allowed the cars to go faster, but of course, if it caught fire, you weren't going to put that fire out.
Yeah, that's.
So yeah, so Schlesser was burnt alive in this car, and the intensity of the fire, it literally burned a hole in the track, and they could not put the fire out until it just burned itself out. So Schlesser was basically incinerated in his car, and there was pretty much nothing left of him. And the other part of this being caught on camera, being broadcasted, um, made people realize that this things needed to change. Um, so there was another driver, Jochen Rindt. His wife, Nina Rindt, said that 1968 was just so crazy with the amount of driver deaths. She said it felt like they were going from one funeral to the next. And this was also when Jackie Stewart's safety crusade tried to really take off with his first approaches towards general safety standard improvements. Um, and it later moved on to focus on tracks having to adapt to the increased evolution of car technology. But the argument that he got back was that the drivers needed to adapt. And this argument came from the track owners and the track managers.
Hmm.
So the first general pushes were for drivers to it being mandatory for drivers to wear fireproof overalls, certified helmets, and then a modern 6-point safety harness. And again, drivers still preferred not to wear seatbelts for the same reason. Still, but after this, Jackie moved on to focus on Armco barriers being put in place and catch fencing for the cars if whenever they went off. But this fight for improved safety was definitely going to be an uphill battle, or it definitely was an uphill battle. And one example of this was during the British Grand Prix 1968. Jackie Stewart wanted some trees removed for safety reasons, and the response that he got from the Royal Automobile Club um, and Motorsport Association was that they said if Jackie Stewart wanted trees removed, he knew where the saws were. So one of the other problems was when if in the Grand Prix Drivers Association, drivers would show up, and according to John Surtees, he said they would show up and quote not say a bloody dicky word, and then afterwards they complain. So it turned out that they realized that the most important thing for these racing administrators was the commercial revenue that came from every race in Formula One, because it was so immensely popular. Um, but these safety standards needed to be added for these drivers to feel safe, even driving at these races. And in 1969, um, Jackie tried to lead the GPDA, the Grand Prix Drivers Association, into boycotting the Spa-Francorchamps circuit. And these track managers and owners, they were so confident that because of the popularity of the commercial value of everything, that these drivers would not be able to boycott any of them. But one of the drivers that didn't say anything was Jack Brabham. But at this point, he was actually a three-time championship winner. I believe he won 1964, but I could be wrong. But yeah, at this point, he was a three-time winner, and he stood up and said, "We're not going." So that was it. They didn't go to Spa-Francorchamps, and they went to Hockenheim instead. But in the following year, 1970, drivers were still dying. Um, One British driver, Martin Brain, there were four drivers killed in 1970 alone. Martin Brain was killed at Silverstone. Um, have you heard of the sports cars Mclaren?
No.
So Mclaren is it's one of the high end um, car companies, kind of like Lamborghini in a way. But they specialize in sports cars for people, civilians today. But they're also a Formula One team now. But the founder, Bruce McLaren, he was from New Zealand. He founded the team, his own team, but he was killed in 1970 at Goodwood in Britain on June 2nd while he was testing one of his new Can-Am cars. But the sad thing is that um, Bruce McLaren, he was killed before he even could see what his racing team has turned into today. Because at that point when he was killed, it was literally just a simple racing team in his name that he created. But now it's a multi-million dollar, probably billion-dollar um, company that is, I guess, in his honor in a way. Um, Piers Courage was killed at Zandvoort during the track's first opening race. And Jochen Rindt, husband of Nina Rindt, he was killed at Monza. But those two deaths, Piers Courage and Jochen Rindt, their two deaths were in themselves kind of um, I don't want to say revolutionary, but they helped push the sport towards being more safe in a way. Um, Jochen Rindt, he actually was driving for Lotus, and he was the leading champion, I should say, he was on his way to become champion. He was leading in the championship of 1970, and he wanted one of his old cars to be delivered to the race, but it was late, and Colin Chapman told him that either he would race the new Lotus or he would not race at all. So against his better judgment, Yuck and Rent chose to race in the new Lotus, and during qualifying, he lost control and crashed in a barrier. I believe it was going upwards of 120, and he was killed. And because of his position in the points in the championship, he was actually the first, and he was in the only posthumous Formula One world champion.
Huh.
And here's courage. He his car flipped and burst into flames, and another driver pulled over and stopped to try and help him, um, but he just couldn't because he had a fireproof overall. But the other marshals that were there, they had either old fireproof overalls or they had none at all. And there was nothing they could do. By the time the fire truck got to them, it was 8 minutes until the fire truck got to them. And Pierce Courage was long dead after that, and it was all caught on camera as well. And you could see the drivers, they kept going. They were not slowing down. They did not stop to help. They just kept going again as per the rules. But this is also the first opening race of Zandvoort since the track's $3.4 million safety renovations to stop stuff like this. But it kept happening.
So you keep mentioning that a lot of these wrecks, especially the later ones in the later 60s and early 70s, were caught on camera. Did that provoke any audience support for what these drivers were calling for in terms of safety?
I don't believe the spectators really had much of a say in any of it. It was mainly just stuff done by those who were there and experiencing the terrible safety hazards that was going on. The wives, the girlfriends,
Yeah.
the drivers themselves, they were all the ones pushing for this. The car manufacturers, all they cared about was winning.
Yeah.
And the track managers, all they cared about was the revenue. They didn't want to pay out of pocket to increase these renovations, but it was the things getting caught on camera. This is what put it in the spotlight, and then they realized they had to do something about this. But there were some interviews that's shown in the documentary of spectators being asked about certain things. This one old man was asked. He was asked how he felt about crashes. I think he was asked specifically if he came to see crashes, and he said yes, we love to see a good crash, but we also want to see the boys drive well. And this other girl was asked if she had any favorite drivers in the race. I want to say this is Zandvoort, and she thought about it for a second, and then she said no, not anymore.
Wow.
Because because they were dead.
Yeah. Well, so I do have one more question.
Yeah.
Prior to all these safety things, what was it that made these drivers who knew the risks continue to do it?
Well, the one thing that you also don't necessarily think about is you have to think about these drivers, these Formula One drivers, as being like modern day. Um, think of them as I guess modern day FIFA players or NFL players or NBA players. They were celebrities of the highest class. They were considered to be prestigious celebrities, and they were performing in a leisure sport, a motorsport. And especially following World War II, it was deemed to be great to do something that was dangerous after World War II, and a lot of drivers in the 50s were actually World War II veterans in some way, shape, or form. One example was a man by the name. You're gonna love this story. Um, Man by the name of Duncan Hamilton. He raced in. He was a World War II a Royal Navy pilot. I believe he flew Lysanders in combat. So he, um, in the 1953 Le Mans, 24 Hours of Le Mans, he went over and found out that his team was disqualified for some dumb reason. So him and his teammate were like, "So we just came all the way from Britain to France for nothing, just to get disqualified." So they're pissed off. They go to the pub and get absolutely just wasted. And then somebody finds them there and tells them that they've been reinstated and they're plastered. So what do? They compete in the 1953 24 Hours of Le Mans, blind drunk, and at each turn when they come back to the pit to switch off, the drivers are being given coffee to sober up. And then one of the drivers, well, Duncan Hamilton, he comes around and he starts refusing the coffee because it's making him jittery. And then, and then the team is like, "Hold the phone. It would be terrible if he just started, if he crashed from a hangover at some point. So what if we kept him drunk by giving him brandy?" So they did. They kept him drunk, and him and his teammate, while blind drunk, ended up winning the 1953 24 Hours of Le Mans.
Holy shit.
Yeah, yeah, they won the 24-hour endurance race, plastered.
Wow, that is just the definition of unsafe.
Oh
Um,
yeah, oh yeah.
so,
Yeah, that's just one example. I mean, he did not care. I mean, he was a World War II vet.
yeah. So, I think we've been going for a little over an hour. Um, so, are there any parting comments, words that you wish to bestow upon the audience about this?
Uh, uh, I guess appreciate the fact that you can watch a race and not have to worry about the possibility of somebody burning to death, um, or dying horribly, or other things like that.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, yeah, and I guess I don't know. Definitely one of the important things is um, I mean, we all like love to, well, not everybody, but a majority of people, I guess, kind of love the fantasy of driving fast or things like that, either from movies or watching Formula One or things like that. Don't do it on a public road. That's not going to end well,
well,
unless you're Jim Clark. Then go for it, I guess.
well, John, it was wonderful having you here. This is something
Yeah,
that
thanks for having me.
I, before you told me about this stuff, I had no interest in Formula One racing whatsoever. But this was absolutely fascinating. I remember you telling me about this way back, this past December. Uh, it was really interesting stuff. Um, what I also found interesting was, you know, you were talking about how it was the drivers who were pushing for all these safety regulations to be instated, which kind of takes it from also being, sports history, makes it kind of sort of puts it in the realm of labor history as well, because you do have like the workers, air
Yeah,
quotes,
yeah,
of this quote unquote industry fighting or advocating for themselves for better safety standards. So you could sort of twist it a little to make it kind of fit within the
you
realm of
can.
labor history, which I think is
Yeah,
just kind of interesting. Um,
yeah. I suppose you can twist it a little bit, but there's also that argument. The drivers didn't help themselves at all.
that is also true. Yeah,
That could just kind of take all of that out.
yeah. It's it's a very complex story, and I think you've done a great job at sharing it with everyone. For those who may have joined late or are watching this, after the fact, the recording of this presentation is going to stay up on Twitch for a couple days. I'm also going to be cutting out this specific portion of the stream and posting it on YouTube, and the audio will also get posted on all the podcast platforms as part of the Bowery Mick History podcast. Although the audio version is not going to have all the nice pictures. So sorry about that. But the YouTube video will have it. So you will be able to check out this stuff. And Jawan, were you able to get this paper published? Because I know you were trying to get it published in Cupola from Gettysburg College.
Yeah, so they rejected that. I have no idea why. They just kind of gave me a cookie cutter email. But I'm gonna need to work on this a little more to kind of tone it up a bit, because I definitely want to expand a bit on like the memory and also go into more things on masculinity in the 60s, which is also a big part of it.
Yeah, I mean, as with all historical projects, this kind of stuff is always ongoing. You're never really done. Well, hey, if you ever want it up on Bowery Mick History, just let me know.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, one of the great things about researching this for this paper was that it was probably some of the easiest research that I had done, because it's on Formula One, and all of the primary sources and things like that, it's all there.
Yeah.
Like the newspapers and things like that, it's all there. So it's definitely doable for anybody that's interested in it.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things definitely, for anybody that's interested, especially you might be interested. Definitely look up the story of Jackie Stewart.
Yeah.
It's definitely one story that's worth looking into.
All right. Well, once again, thank you, Jawan. You've been great. It's been great having a bit of big change of pace from what's been on the Twitch channel so far. So far, I've just been doing World War II shit and a couple things outside of World War II shit. But it's nice to do something outside of war in general.
Yeah, that's fair. But outside of war, but we're sticking with the theme of death.
I mean, death is inevitable. That took a dark turn. So for those still watching, I'm going to take another maybe 15-20 minute break. Then we'll be back with the last part of the stream today. So once again, thank you, Jawan, and we'll see you guys.
You're doing
later.
Ultimate General, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't know what I'm gonna do in Ultimate General. But we'll see what happens. All right. So.
All right.